Well, hello again. Welcome to week 4 of Theology and Entertainment. I hope that you are enjoying your readings and your discussion boards. I sure have been enjoying reading them. This week we are going to further develop the idea of entertainment as teacher. Pieper has already kind of introduced this a little bit, I think, in each of his books. And you've probably already come across this idea in some of the other assigned readings that you've had. But I really want to develop a couple of other aspects of entertainment, specifically its ability to teach us in very unique ways, which can be used for good or for ill, right? We learn in a special way, especially in the context of memory through entertainment. Okay, we remember things which entertain us. For example, a great story, a great movie, a great play, a great piece of music. It embeds itself into our memory in a way that can be very powerful. And so when we are entertained by teaching, that can be very good, or that can also be very problematic when we're being ingrained with things that have moral issues, right? When we're watching movies that have a negative impact on us, that can be very detrimental. Music, for example, when we pump music into our ears that has messages that are against our faith, against our cultural outlook, that can be very detrimental to our behavior, for example. I want to look at a couple of aspects of entertainment, especially in a Christian sense, one of them being Jesus's way of teaching, okay? And so any good teacher will strive to captivate the imagination and the attention of his audience, right? If your students aren't listening to you, which I can't really tell because you're on a video screen right now, so you might not be listening to me, I don't know. But if your students aren't listening to you, they're not going to learn, they're not going to be formed by the teaching that you're giving, no matter how good that teaching is. And so we see this aspect of entertainment as teacher being able to hone in on the ability of a teacher to captivate his audience, okay? Now, you know, you could say what you want about Jesus' teaching style. Some people really focus on this idea that he was kind of an entertainer and that he wowed the crowds with these miracles. I don't really put too much stock in that. I think that that can be very distracting from the real purpose of miracles and the great works that he does in the Gospels. But one particular, excuse me, one particular style of teaching that he does, excuse me, use very characteristically is the parable, okay? And so on your reading assignment, I've listed several parables that I'd like you to read because I think they're a good example of what a parable is. Some of you are probably already pretty familiar with parables. But basically a parable is a core part of Jesus' teaching style. In the Gospel it says Jesus always uses parables, right? It says in one place in the Gospel it says that he never taught without parables. He uses something that his audience knows to teach them about something they don't know, right? So he'll use a very familiar example, and then he'll draw them to a deeper understanding using that very familiar example, right? So a mustard seed, a field in which seed is being sown, a person digging in the ground, a wedding feast, somebody building a house, right? He uses all these very common examples that people are familiar with, and he uses them as the context for a teaching that he wants to give them, which is often in various levels, okay? That's one of the great things about parables, is you can go deeper and deeper into the parable. The first level might be pretty obvious, but then we keep finding these deeper and deeper levels to the parable. Okay? So I want you to read those parables and get a sense of what Jesus is teaching us through these. And it's a very good example of a powerful, kind of entertaining, if you will, style of teaching, drawing someone into a story, however that's short that story might be. Now, some of his parables are longer, where he gives kind of a full account of a person, maybe even for years of their life, right? Like in the parable of the lost son. Some of them are very, very short, just a couple of lines. But they're all examples of him drawing our attention to something that we know in order to teach us something that we don't know. So teaching through stories can be a very powerful and entertaining way of teaching because it gives us something to latch onto in our memory. We remember the story. Okay, if you give someone just a bulleted list of facts versus a long story in which that bulleted list of facts is intertwined, right? So like if I just start telling you like dates of when a guy was born, when he died, when he got married, all this stuff, if I just give you a list of facts, you're probably not going to remember that. You're going to forget it. But instead, if I present to you a play about a person where all these facts are interwoven into a story, you're going to remember those a lot better. Maybe you won't remember the numbers, but you'll remember those in the context of this person's life. So stories are very powerful ways of teaching. For one reason, because they invite us to enter into the story. Okay, they invite us to imagine how we would react in that story. This is something that J.R.R. Tolkien talked a little bit about in his essay on fairy stories that you read a couple of weeks ago. But we learn by entering into that secondary world, that world of the sub-creation that Tolkien talks about. And so we can form our moral imagination from that, for example. So we imagine this story and then we evaluate the character's actions. We say, well, this character should have done that or they shouldn't have done that. Well, we do that naturally and easily, but what are we doing? We're really entering into that moral sphere. We're entering into that moral situation and we're causing ourselves to make that decision for ourselves. So that can be a very powerful way of learning and teaching. Teaching through heroes is something that we'll talk a little bit more about when we talk about Man for All Seasons, which is one of your assigned texts, and that's a play that we're going to ask you to come and visit and watch on campus. The aspect of tragedy is something that Pieper has already introduced if you've read his book on festivity. And I know that we're having trouble getting some of those in the bookstore. Hopefully you got the email I sent you with some summaries of that book. But Pieper introduces this idea of tragedy as being a great example of Christian celebration, that we celebrate in a way through tragedy. Tragedy is really one of the primary means of celebration in a Christian sense, again rooted in the Paschal mystery, that is through Jesus' death that we gain eternal life. Well, what Pieper says is that tragedy is always a moment to reflect on the fact that God overcomes the evil of the world. So any tragedy is an example of that for Pieper. I've included an article by a man by the name of Truman who writes on this subject as part of your assigned readings. So tragedy can be a way of entertainment. We're drawn into these stories, sometimes these tragic stories, but then there's a lesson being taught. There's maybe moral lessons of how the characters could have or should have reacted, but then I think there's a larger lesson too of the meaning of life, for example. What's really important? When somebody goes through a tragedy and they emerge on the other side of that tragedy, what have they learned? How have they put their life in a different perspective, for example? So tragedy can be a great means of teaching through entertainment. What Truman says in his article is that we tend to shy away from tragedy in modern entertainment. I think that can be argued with, but I think it's a good point nonetheless, is that the ancients and the medievals were a little bit more in touch with tragedy in their way of celebrating and seeking entertainment, if you will. Okay, so entertainment as story, entertainment as parable, this idea of teaching someone about a greater truth through a very common story. And the term parable literally means, if you look at the etymology of that word, it literally means to roll up alongside, to parabole, to roll up something alongside something else. So imagine like a ball rolling down the street and then you roll one up next to it, and so they're both traveling at the same rate and at the same trajectory. That's what a parable is that you teach a news story by comparing it and making it similar to an existing story. For those of you who like math, right, like a parabolic curve, well, what is that? It's symmetrical, right? It goes in the same trajectory. That's what a parable is. So it can be a great way of teaching. Stories are a great way of being entertained, but they're also a great way of learning truths. But we have to be careful what kind of stories we're seeking, right? Because we're being formed by the stories we hear, by the entertainment we seek, by our music, by our art, sometimes in ways that we don't realize. So it has great means for goodness, but also can be used for evil, as I think we see in our contemporary culture. Another note about entertainment and the way we are taught by it that I think is interesting to reflect on is the number of times in popular entertainment, movies, books, music, that theological themes emerge. Perhaps very unintendedly from the perspective of the author or the musician or the director of the movie. That we see time and again in movies that we're drawn to, we see very Christian themes, right? Well, I would argue that this isn't because all these authors are trying to interject specifically biblical themes into their movies. Sometimes we see that. Usually when that happens, it's not a very good movie, to be quite honest. But greater than that, I think it's because these themes are the natural human themes, right? That's what we're naturally interested in. We are drawn to stories of struggle and overcoming evil and good emerging victorious. We're drawn to stories where somebody deals with sin and overcomes it through heroic effort. We're drawn to stories of tragedy that I mentioned earlier because we learn about the meaning of life through those. So I think we're naturally drawn to all these stories, so they come out when people start doing art. They come out in paintings, and they come out in stories. They come out in music, right? So I think that's one very interesting aspect of entertainment, is that we are naturally entertained by the Christian story. Now, you might say, wait a minute, I was bored to death at Sunday school, or I was always bored in church. Well, sometimes these stories might not be presented in the most entertaining ways, at least the way that we're used to being entertained. But if you really look at the story itself, the great story of salvation history, it's fascinating. It's wildly entertaining. There's heroes, and there's villains, and there's epic battles, and there's struggles, and there's rejoicing. All the things that we're interested in are in the Bible. They're in the story of the church. They're part of the human story. So I think sometimes we can, if we're looking at entertainment through a Christian lens, we can start drawing out some of these meanings, even if the author didn't mean them. Sometimes when the author might have meant the total opposite of the meaning we're getting out of it, but we approach this entertainment seeking what's important to us, right? So one person can go to a movie and get one thing out of it. Another can go to a movie and get something totally different. It largely has to do with what that person is seeking and how that person has been formed to look out on the world. So in that sense, our entertainment to some degree, now I want to be careful because some entertainment is just diabolical, okay? It just is. But to some degree, entertainment has a level of ambiguity. It's neither good or bad. It's what we see in it and what we get out of it, okay? So I think that's an interesting aspect of entertainment too. And I put a couple of articles about the Hunger Games, for example. I think a very interesting trilogy of books that came out recently. It's got a lot of Christian themes in it that perhaps the author didn't even intend, but I think that we can draw a lot of meaning out of. So something else to think about. Entertainment as a window to the great human story that we're really all seeking, and that can give us hopefully some insights into the questions that we all have. So those are just a few things to think about this week as you do your assigned readings on entertainment, thinking about the power entertainment has of teaching us. So good luck with your readings and with your discussion boards, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.